Richard Dawkins, welcome to Auckland and to the University of Auckland.
Thank you.
New Zealand's a little country pleased to get attention from the rest of the world. What in the evolution of the unusual fauna of New Zealand would you see as offering striking examples of evolution at work and as impossible to explain in terms of creation or so-called intelligent design?
New Zealand was part of the great southern continent of Gondwana, which broke up, and whereas other fragments of Gondwana carried mammals with them, New Zealand had no mammals, and so birds who could get there evolved to fill the shoes that would have been filled by mammals in the rest of the world. So that's a very interesting case of almost an exception proving a rule. It's a lovely example.
Given that I want to offer some slightly different questions to some you might have been asked, and given that this is for an educational institution, you had an extraordinarily uplifting experience of secondary school at Oundle, is it, or Oundle?
Oundle.
Oundle.
Yes.
And you studied under the great zoologist Nico Tinbergen. You seem to have a rare passion for education, for the educability of the world. Is that part of what explains your antagonism to creationism, that it gets in the way of educating people about the richness of the world and the mind?
I've been a professional educator all my career, and I do feel very strongly about it. Nico Tinbergen was my supervisor, my research supervisor at Oxford, and earlier in my life I was at school at Oundle, which had had a great headmaster in the he died in 1922, but his spirit kind of lived on, and he had this spirit of wanting each boy, it was only boys in those days, it's girls as well now, each boy's, whatever he was good at, whatever he was interested in, had to be fostered and cultivated, sort of individual treatment. There's a wonderful anecdote told by an ex-pupil who was so interested in something that he sneaked out to the school library in the middle of the night when he should have been asleep in the dormitory, and was caught by the headmaster in there, who was furious about this. And then the headmaster said, "Well, since you're here, what are you reading?" And so he showed him this book, which I think it was about engineering. And the headmaster sat down with him for an hour in the middle of the night and went over engineering and design and what this boy hoped to achieve in his life and things like that. And then finally he said, "Well, we must find some more time in the day for you for this. Now go back to bed." And the boy, who is now grown up, said this was one of the most formative experiences of his life. And I had an experience at Oundle with a much younger master who never actually met Sanderson, but was inspired by Sanderson to teach in his way. And the story that I told, which you're probably remembering, was how this man, his name is Johan Thomas, taught zoology. He asked us what animal feeds on hydra. Hydra is a little sea lantern, lives in fresh water. And of course none of us knew, and we all said, guessed, we all guessed. One boy guessed this, one boy guessed that, one boy. And we got all kind of eager, and we were going, "Sir, sir, sir, what animal does feed on hydra?" And then he said, "I don't know." And I don't think Mr. Coulson knows either. And he stormed next door, where his senior colleague was teaching, dragged Mr. Coulson in and said, "Mr. Coulson, do you know what animal feeds on hydra?" And Mr. Coulson must have been briefed, I think, because he didn't know either. And I said, none of us would ever have forgotten that lesson. You don't have to know the answer. The whole point about science is you're working on it. You're doing the necessary investigation to find the answer. It's okay to don't know.
In your first book, The Selfish Gene, you're very explicit about your audience, the general reader, the expert and the student. Who you're writing for in The Greatest Show on Earth?
Mostly the general reader, but actually the other two as well. It's a book about the evidence for evolution, and it's at least partly supposed to convince people who are at present not convinced of the evidence for evolution. But actually I suspect that people who are really anti-evolution don't read books anyway.
Well, not by you.
Well, except one book. They read the Bible and that's
yes.
it. So it's for people who are open-minded, people who perhaps had the subject left out of their education, which sadly means most people actually, because for some reason it isn't taught early in your career. And so if you're not taught it till you're about 16, maybe you miss out on it altogether. It should be taught at the age of about 8, because it is the account of why we all exist. This is why we're here. This is why we are so apparently well designed. This is why birds are here, why mammals are here, why fish are here, dolphins are here. It is an amazingly powerful idea. It's not that difficult to understand. Children should learn about it, but they don't until often too late.
And you're working on that for your next book, aren't you?
Well, I am working on a children's book, which is aimed at about 12-year-olds, but perhaps a bit younger than that.
Okay.
This is about science more generally,
Right.
not specifically. There's some evolution in it, but it's also about other aspects of science. And myths. Each chapter begins with, each chapter is a question, like what is a rainbow, what is an earthquake, what is the sun? And each chapter begins with a set of 3 or 4 myths that answer the question, like the Aztec myth of the sun, that original myth of the sun, whatever it is, and then what really is the sun. And then we go on to another chapter and we get another set of myths. And among the myths, I'm going to be burying the Judeo-Christian myth. It'll just be in there with the other myths so that there's no privileged treatment for it.
Oh, very good. I can't wait to see that. Well, can we just walk through the book quickly? Can I get you to talk in bullet points? Just each of your chapters focuses on a different argument for evolution, doesn't it? And if you can just sum up a little, the argument from artificial selection.
Yes, this was something that Darwin himself made great use of. Most people are familiar with the fact that dogs are bred by human breeders. They all come from wolves originally. And what's spectacular about dogs is how different they are, both from each other and from wolves, all achieved in a matter of centuries. Whereas biological evolution, natural evolution, has hundreds of millions of years to achieve results. So if you take the amount of change between a wolf and a Yorkshire Terrier, or a wolf and a Pekingese, and that just took a few millennia, I suppose, then you multiply that up by the hundreds of millions of years that were available for natural evolution. The only difference is that instead of there being a human breeder, there is natural survival. Some survive, some don't. The ones that survive breed, so that's equivalent to a human breeder choosing who to breed from.
Right. The argument from active selection by non-human animals in Chapter 3.
Yes, this is a kind of bridge. I call it the primrose path. I'm going to seduce the reader in. Something like a peahen or a female bird of paradise choosing males. This is not a deliberate choice for artificial selection reasons. It's rather just that female birds do have certain preferences, and it's those preferences that have shaped the way the male is. So female peahens apparently like males with great big long tails, and so that's an automatic process, presumably unconscious. It doesn't have to be unconscious, but it might be unconscious. So in this case, the peahen is playing the role of human breeder, and once again we dispense with the human. We go straight to nature.
And once again, it's an idea that Darwin came up with.
It's an idea that Darwin was, yes.
Yes. The argument from chronology.
Well, in Darwin's time, it wasn't possible to date fossils. It was just clear to Darwin they must be old. Darwin had a problem with that because the leading physicist of the day in Britain, Lord Kelvin, calculated on erroneous assumptions that the whole solar system was only a few tens of millions of years old, which wouldn't be enough, Darwin reckoned, for evolution to take place. Darwin was worried by this. I mean, what he should have said is, well, I'm sorry, your Lord Kelvin, if that's what your physics tells you, your physics must be wrong, because the biology clearly shows evolution's happened. Kelvin's calculation was done before anybody knew anything about the energy from radiation. So it was actually George Darwin, Charles Darwin's, I think, second son, who was one of those who made the argument that actually the sun doesn't have to be only tens of millions of years old. It is, in fact, thousands of millions of years old. So there's plenty of time. Nowadays, we know how old each fossil is. Strictly speaking, we only know how old igneous rock is, basalt and lava. Because at the moment when the lava solidifies, at that moment, radioactive clocks are, in a sense, zeroed. Radioactive clocks are radioactive isotopes, in which one element decays to another element. And so, from the moment when the clock is zeroed, that means the moment when the say, a bubble is formed which contains the, say, potassium, which is going to decay to argon. So at the beginning of that time, the only radioactive potassium, the supply of radioactive potassium is the starting amount, when there's no argon. And then as the millions of years go by, some of the potassium decays at a known rate, a known half-life, to argon. And so if you find a bit of rock, a bit of lava, you, by measuring the amount of potassium and the amount of argon, the appropriate isotopes, you can calculate how old that rock is. Now, igneous rock's no good for fossils. Fossils form in sedimentary rock, but that doesn't matter because you find igneous rocks associated with sedimentary rocks, and so you can date fossils. And by the same token, you can date the Earth. And that's how we know the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. And that's how we know that any particular fossil is so many millions of years, so many tens of millions, so many hundreds of millions of years.
Right. The argument from present evolution, both natural and experimental.
Yes, well, if you look comparatively at different animals or different plants, Darwin did a lot of this as well, you see how closely they resemble each other. You look at their limb bones, you look at their skulls. Nowadays you look at their molecules, which is much more powerful. And you can work out the degree of resemblance. You actually calculate the degree of resemblance. So nowadays with molecular genetics you can actually count the number of digital symbols in the genes that are the same and the number that are different. And you look at the pattern of resemblance. And the pattern of resemblance turns out to fall on a beautiful branching hierarchical tree, which clearly has to be a family tree. It's a pedigree. Darwin recognized that. But what Darwin didn't know was the immense power of doing the same thing that he did with anatomy, doing the same thing with molecules, with genes. And when you do that, then the case is just made with all the more force. There really is a single tree of life, and we are within sight of knowing what that tree of life is.
And the argument from embryology or development?
That's become less fashionable than in Darwin's time, because in Darwin's time, or slightly later than Darwin, it was thought that embryos, so to speak, climbed up their family tree and as it were, retraced the steps of their ancestry. We don't think that anymore. Nevertheless, embryology does show us stages in the ancestral past. So human embryos have a tail, for example, which then shrinks. They have the equivalent of gill slits, which then shrink. Whale embryos have hind limbs, which then shrink, almost completely disappear. So embryos bear traces of history. So do adults bear traces of history as well, by the way. But embryos are particularly good for that. And
the argument from geographical distribution, well,
Darwin again was very keen on that. If you look at the distribution of species over the islands and continents of the world, you find it's exactly the way it should be if evolution had happened, and it's definitely not the way it should be if they'd all dispersed from Noah's Ark, which, by the way, some 40% of the American population think they did. I mean, Darwin was very struck, rather with hindsight, he wasn't so much struck at the time, by the distribution of animals in the Galapagos Islands, and plants as well. The Galapagos Islands being an archipelago, some way off, about 600 miles off the coast of South America. The fauna and flora is clearly South American, but it's rather different from South America nevertheless. And each island has its own characteristic species or subspecies. And so the obvious inference, which is clearly correct, is that the archipelago got colonized by freak events blown across the sea from the mainland onto one of the islands. They then evolved separately from South America. The whole archipelago evolved separately from South America, but then each island evolved separately from each other, with rather less rare freak events getting blown across from island to island. And that's why you have so many species of finch on the Galapagos Islands, and the tortoises, the giant tortoises, show the same thing. The mockingbirds show the same thing. It was the mockingbirds that first alerted Darwin.